This is not how trade wars backfire. A tariff gets imposed in February 2025. Canadian exporters absorb initial losses. American officials declare victory. And then, without announcement, Canadian infrastructure investment shifts north. Port facilities in Hudson Bay that were regional grain terminals begin receiving container ships from Hamburg. Railway upgrades become strategic corridors bypassing American logistics entirely. The adjustment happens in procurement decisions and shipping contracts that never make headlines. And by the time American trade negotiators recognize the pattern, Canadian commerce has already restructured around routes that treat the United States as optional. Most people think tariffs impose costs that force policy concessions. They assume leverage flows from market size rather than from alternatives. That assumption is the misread. What I am describing is documented infrastructure development and trade diversification Canada implemented throughout 2025 in direct response to American tariffs. The port upgrades are operational. The shipping contracts are signed. The alternative trade relationships have been formalized. Public conversation about tariffs focused on immediate impacts, Canadian lumber prices, steel exports, agricultural barriers. These were presented as pressure points forcing Canadian concessions. The assumption was Canada, facing reduced access to its largest partner, would accept American terms. That assumption stopped being true the moment Canada decided to build alternatives rather than accept constraints. This is not retaliation, it is reconstruction. The Hudson Bay Railway running from Winnipeg to Churchill represents the clearest example of how infrastructure converts trade pressure into strategic autonomy. For decades, this line served regional grain shipments to a northern port used only during brief ice-free periods. Southern routes through American ports were faster, cheaper, and available year-round. American tariffs changed that calculation immediately. When tariffs add costs to Canadian exports moving through U.S. territory, when American logistics become unpredictable due to political interference, the premium for northern routes shrinks. Canadian response was not to negotiate for tariff removal. Canadian response was to accelerate Churchill Port development and railway upgrades that make Hudson Bay a viable alternative to Great Lakes shipping routes flowing through American territory. The investment timeline compressed dramatically. Projects scheduled across decades got fast-tracked into 18-month deployments. By September 2025, Churchill was handling container ships that previously would have unloaded in American ports. By November, Canadian wheat was reaching European markets via Hudson Bay routes, bypassing the St. Lawrence system entirely. By January 2026, the port was operating at capacity levels that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. The transformation was not just operational, it was strategic. Every ton of Canadian exports reaching international markets through Churchill, rather than through American territory, is a ton that American tariff policy cannot touch, and American logistics no longer profits from. This is where trade pressure converts into trade independence. Canadian energy exports traditionally flowing to American refineries began shifting toward Asian markets through Western ports. Critical minerals found Chinese and European buyers willing to pay premium prices. Agricultural products facing American tariffs got redirected to faster-growing markets. Each redirection required infrastructure investment. Each investment created capacity that persists regardless of whether American tariffs eventually get removed. The ports built to serve Asian markets do not disappear when trade relations normalize. The shipping contracts signed with European buyers do not automatically cancel if Washington reverses policy. The infrastructure Canada built in response to American pressure is permanent. The trade relationships established as alternatives are sticky. Even if every tariff gets removed tomorrow, Canadian commerce will not automatically revert because the alternatives are now operational and often more profitable. American tariffs were supposed to impose costs, forcing policy changes. What they actually did was provide political justification for infrastructure investments Canada wanted to make anyway, but faced domestic opposition when framed as unnecessary expenses. The tariffs made the investments necessary. The investments made American markets optional. And optional markets do not provide leverage. Mark Carney's role in articulating this response, according to unconfirmed reports, represents a fundamental shift in Canadian leadership thinking. Previous frameworks treated American market access as essential and any disruption as crisis requiring immediate restoration through concessions. The new framework treats American market access as one option among several and any disruption as opportunity to accelerate diversification. The goal is not to restore the previous relationship. The goal is to build infrastructure that makes restoration unnecessary. The sophistication lies in recognizing that tariffs impose costs on both parties and that the party investing in alternatives recovers faster. American industries dependent on Canadian inputs faced immediate cost increases. Canadian exporters faced revenue losses. Both experienced pain. The question was, which side would adapt faster? Canada adapted by building infrastructure. America adapted by expecting capitulation. The asymmetry determined which side gained leverage. By late 2025, draft assessments from Canadian trade officials suggested export diversification away from American markets had proceeded faster than any previous trade adjustment in Canadian history. The proportion destined for American markets declined by measurable percentages as Asian and European destinations absorbed volumes. The speed was possible because infrastructure enabling redirection was being built in parallel with negotiations. Canada was not waiting to see if pressure would force concessions. Canada was building alternatives while American officials assumed none existed. The Churchill Port development timeline exemplifies this. Planning documents were prepared before tariffs were imposed. Funding was allocated within weeks of tariff announcement. Construction accelerated on impossible schedules. The message was clear. Canada was treating American pressure not as temporary disruption, but as permanent condition requiring structural response. The USMCA review scheduled for July 2026 represents the inflection point where this strategy either validates or collapses. American officials assumed 18 months of tariff pressure would bring Canada to that review, desperate to restore market access on whatever terms Washington demanded. The reality is approaching differently. Canada is approaching with operational alternatives that did not exist when tariffs were imposed. Churchill is operational. Asian trade relationships are formalized. European buyers have contracts. The infrastructure making American market access optional is built and functioning. American negotiators cannot threaten to maintain tariffs because Canadian commerce has already adjusted. They cannot threaten to increase tariffs because Canadian exports increasingly flow through routes American policy cannot touch. They cannot threaten to cut off access entirely because American industries need Canadian inputs more than Canadian suppliers need any single destination. Leverage has reversed. The party that imposed tariffs to gain negotiating power finds itself negotiating from weakness because the targeted party built alternatives rather than waiting for relief. This is not unprecedented in trade history. Countries facing economic pressure either collapse or adapt through structural adjustment. What makes the Canadian response unusual is the speed and scale. Infrastructure that normally requires decades got compressed into months. Trade relationships that typically evolve gradually got formalized rapidly. The compression was possible because Canadian planning anticipated American pressure and prepared contingencies before pressure materialized. When tariffs got imposed, the response was executing plans already prepared. American tariffs provided political justification. Canadian voters who might have questioned expensive infrastructure projects became supportive when framed as necessary responses to American economic attacks. The political economy shifted from why fix what is not broken to why remain dependent on partners who weaponize trade. The shift accelerated timelines that would have been impossible without crisis framing. Projects facing years of consultation got fast-tracked through emergency authorities. The result was infrastructure deployment at speeds that transformed Canadian logistics capacity within the window when American officials expected Canada to remain dependent. By the time American trade officials recognized Canadian infrastructure was creating alternatives rather than temporary coping mechanisms, construction was substantially complete. The moment to prevent diversification by offering tariff relief was early 2025. By late 2025, the infrastructure was operational enough that tariff relief would not reverse the strategic shift. The exports flowing through Churchill to European markets are not going to be redirected back through American ports just because tariffs get removed. The shipping companies have signed contracts. The logistics networks have been optimized. There is no economic reason to abandon it, even if political relations improve. This is how temporary trade pressure creates permanent strategic realignment. The American miscalculation was assuming Canadian dependence on American markets was structural rather than logistical. The dependence was real, but based on infrastructure convenience rather than absolute necessity. Canadian exports flowed south because infrastructure made southern routes cheaper and easier. When American tariffs increased costs of southern routes, the advantage disappeared. Canadian exports could reach European and Asian markets through northern routes at costs competitive with tariffed American access. The infrastructure needed was buildable within timelines shorter than the period American officials expected Canada to remain under pressure. The result is that American tariffs triggered exactly the outcome they were supposed to prevent: Canadian economic independence from American market access. Instead of forcing policy concessions, the tariffs provided justification for infrastructure investments that eliminate the leverage American market access previously provided. Geography determines logistics. Logistics determine trade patterns. Trade patterns determine dependencies. Canada rebuilt logistics to change trade patterns to eliminate dependencies. Canadian officials compressed timelines to make alternatives operational before American patience for maintaining pressure expired. The side that moved faster gained advantage. Infrastructure beats pressure when timelines compress faster than pressure can force capitulation. The USMCA review in July 2026 will determine whether this shift becomes permanent. The outcome depends on which side has more to lose from failure to reach agreement. American industries need Canadian inputs. Canadian exporters want American market access. Both sides benefit from trade. The question is whether American officials recognize that Canadian alternatives are now operational enough that threatening market access no longer provides leverage. If American negotiators approach assuming Canadian desperation, they will discover Canadian commerce has moved on. If they approach recognizing Canadian alternatives are operational and offer terms that make American markets attractive relative to existing alternatives, agreement becomes possible. The leverage lies with the side that has functioning alternatives. Canada spent 2025 building those alternatives. America spent 2025 assuming alternatives were impossible. By the time that review concludes, the trade relationship will have been fundamentally restructured. Either American officials negotiate as equals, or Canadian commerce continues developing alternatives, while American industries absorb costs of reduced access to Canadian inputs. Geography determines infrastructure. Infrastructure determines alternatives. Alternatives determine leverage. Canada converted American trade pressure into infrastructure development that created alternatives that provide leverage. This is not how trade wars were supposed to work. This is how they work when the targeted country has geography, resources, and leadership sophisticated enough to convert pressure into opportunity. The tariffs were supposed to force Canadian compliance. They created Canadian independence. And by the time American officials recognize what happened, the infrastructure making independence operational will be too established to reverse. This is how middle powers respond when great powers mistake proximity for dependency. This is how geography becomes weapon. And this is how trade pressure backfires when the targeted country builds alternatives faster than the imposing country expects capitulation.